It is time to spill the sweet tea because Dolly Parton is finally dropping the names of the 6 singers she secretly cannot stand. She is universally recognised as country music's ultimate sweetheart, renowned worldwide for her rhinestone-studded smile, her heart of pure gold, and a seemingly bottomless well of kindness for every single soul she encounters. However, lurking behind Dolly Parton's meticulously curated brand of eternal sunshine and butterflies is a grit forged during a career that has spanned 6 hard-fighting decades in one of the most ruthless and cutthroat industries on the planet. And while she has navigated the treacherous waters of superstardom with a level of grace that seems almost superhuman, even a saint like Dolly has not been immune to the toxic dynamics, creative power struggles, and massive ego clashes that define relationships in show business. Now, after decades of biting her tongue and maintaining her legendary status as Switzerland in the Great Wars of Nashville, the facade is cracking. Dolly has officially decided to pull back the curtain and open up about the 6 specific musical relationships that pushed her famous patience and positivity to the absolute breaking point. We are talking about everything from creative partners who morphed into bitter business rivals to a certain goddaughter whose chaotic lifestyle choices left Dolly deeply worried and frustrated. These are the messy, complicated and dramatic entanglements that expose a gritty, raw side of Dolly Parton that the public almost never gets the privilege to witness. The legendary songwriter who penned "I Will Always Love You" as a brutal goodbye letter has not always found it a walk in the park to keep the peace with her fellow superstars. And honestly, her brutally honest reflections might just completely revolutionise the way you look at the reigning queen of country music. While she has plenty of stories from back in 1990, like when Tim McGraw was just an opener, we have to skip straight to the real drama at number 6, Wynonna Judd. This is a classic case of what happens when big personalities collide. On paper, you would think Dolly Parton and Wynonna Judd would be thick as thieves and natural allies. Both of these women clawed their way out of intense Appalachian poverty to become powerhouse vocalists with styles so distinct you can recognise them in a single note, and both managed to balance massive mainstream success while keeping their deep country roots alive. Both of them built massive empires by being unapologetically authentic in a Nashville machine that usually preferred its female stars to be quiet, compliant, and cookie-cutter conventional. Yet, despite having biography pages that look nearly identical, or perhaps exactly because they are too much alike, their dynamic has been chilly at best. For decades, their relationship has been defined by what industry insiders politely call a respectful distance, rather than the warm, sisterly friendship fans might expect. The reasons behind this disconnect speak volumes about how 2 women with similar trauma and backgrounds can develop radically opposing survival mechanisms for life and their careers. I have always had a massive amount of respect for Wynonna's talent because that voice of hers is just a sheer force of nature, Dolly admitted, with rare honesty. In a revealing moment during a 2019 sit-down with Nashville Live, she clarified the tension by simply stating, "But we are just very different types of women. I have always operated on the belief that I need to light up a room the second I walk into it, whereas Wynonna carries a much different, heavier energy, not necessarily better or worse, just fundamentally different." That incredibly diplomatic assessment is barely covering up what Nashville insiders have described as awkward backstage tension during the award show circuits of the 1990s, back when both icons were sitting at the top of the charts. While things never quite exploded into a public screaming match or an outright feud, the vibe was undeniably stiff. Their interactions were reportedly defined by a frosty, cool professionalism that lacked any genuine warmth, with Dolly feeling that some singers have a tendency to drain the energy right out of a room. "I like to be the one to light it up," Dolly reportedly whispered to her band members after a particularly grueling and tense rehearsal for an awards show. That shady little comment, which was never intended for the public to hear perfectly, encapsulates the massive divide in how they handle both their stage performance and their interpersonal relationships. Thomas Westfield, a former producer for the CMA Awards, remembers watching their polar opposite styles clash firsthand behind the scenes. He recalled that Dolly would sweep in like a hurricane of glitter and positive vibes, making a point to greet every single stagehand by their first name. She would be cracking jokes, laughing, and making every person from the janitor to the director feel like the most important person in the building. Winona, on the other hand, was much more internal and brooding, often mistaken for being stuck up or aloof, when in reality she was likely just hyper-focused or battling her own inner demons and pressures. These massive differences went way deeper than just personality quirks. They extended right into the DNA of their artistic choices and branding. While Dolly leaned into the campy aesthetic of rhinestones wigs and aggressive femininity, Winona projected a serious, rock-edged and sometimes dark artistic persona. It was a clash of musical philosophies, Dolly's crisp, bright soprano voice standing in stark contrast to Winona's gritty, bluesy, emotional belt representing the two extreme ends of the country vocal spectrum. Perhaps the most telling sign of the rift was during Winona's incredibly dark period following her mother Naomi's retirement and the subsequent family fallout. During the height of Winona's complicated and public drama with her sister, Ashley Dolly maintained a very noticeable and deliberate distance from the situation. Unlike her usual role as the industry's mother hen, who fixes everything, she seemed to realise that her toxic positivity approach might not mix well with Winona's heavy emotional journey. I honestly did not understand the depth of Winona's darkness for a very long time, Dolly admitted in a reflective interview in 2026, looking back on her past dynamics. I have certainly had my own struggles and heartaches, but my coping mechanism was always to plaster on a smile and push through the pain. Some people need to process their trauma differently, and it took me years to respect that our approaches could both be valid without one being wrong. This level of insight reveals just how much Dolly has grown, highlighting the complex layers of a relationship that was never quite as simple as people thought. It is a recognition that her brand of perpetual optimism is not a universal cure-all for everyone else's suffering. What makes this dynamic particularly fascinating is that despite the personal friction, both women have maintained a professional reverence for one another. Winona has performed covers of Dolly's songs in her concerts, and Dolly has never missed an opportunity to praise Winona's vocal power in the press. Their relationship represents something much more nuanced than a simple friendship or a bitter rivalry. It is a complicated recognition of two survivors navigating the same road in two different vehicles. As Dolly herself summed it up with that characteristic country wisdom she is famous for, "Honey, in this business you do not have to be best friends to respect someone's gift, because sometimes the people who are most like you are the hardest ones to get close to. It is like staring into a mirror and seeing a different version of yourself staring back, and I've always known deep down that if we ever harmonised, it would be pure magic." The moment I heard her belt out that tune, something clicked in my spirit, and I thought I can match that energy because her voice just reached right into my soul. Number 5, the Reba McEntire situation, the rivalry nobody wanted to talk about. For literal decades, the press in Nashville has danced around one burning question, treating it like a loaded gun they were afraid to touch. Who actually wears the crown as the Queen of Country? Is it the Smoky Mountain songbird Dolly Parton or the fiery redhead from Oklahoma Reba McEntire? While the fan bases have practically gone to war over this debate on message boards and bar stools, the two icons at the centre of the storm kept things so polite and sugary sweet that most people bought into the idea that there was zero friction. However, the reality which Dolly has slowly started to peel back the layers on is a whole lot more complicated than the public realised. Reba and I, we have always had this unspoken agreement, Dolly confessed during a remarkably raw sit-down with Nashville Insider back in 2022. We might have risen to fame in slightly different decades, but we were fighting the exact same wars, and we made sure to stay out of each other's lanes out of respect. We might have been grinning for the cameras on stage, but make no mistake, we both knew exactly what was on the line. That rare moment of honesty about their silent turf war sent ripples through Music Row, finally validating what the industry power players had whispered about for years. Underneath all those compliments and gracious sound bites, there was a fierce, razor-sharp professional battle happening. It was inevitable that they would clash because their trajectories were nearly identical. Both women reinvented themselves from small-town girls with unique vocals into massive multimedia moguls conquering movies, TV screens and corporate boardrooms. They both crafted public brands that were instantly identifiable from a single silhouette. And both of them displayed a level of business shark instincts in a male-dominated industry that constantly made the mistake of thinking pretty women could not do math. They were chasing down the exact same pot of gold without ever actually saying the words out loud. Martin Reynolds, a former high-level executive at CBS who managed television projects for both superstars, breaks it down. Back in the 1990s, the networks were not handing out blank checks. There were only a handful of slots for country variety shows, very few prestigious Vegas residencies, and limited shelf space for celebrity perfume or clothing lines. These women were trailblazers hacking through the jungle of the entertainment business, but the pie was only so big and everyone wanted the biggest slice. This rivalry seeped into everything from who booked the biggest stadiums to who snagged the Grammy nominations and even how the general public perceived their stardom. Dolly carefully curated her brand around being the approachable, wisecracking aunt figure, while Reba carved out a niche as the sophisticated, dramatic leading lady of the genre. Because they took such different stylistic approaches, they managed to avoid being compared side by side too often. But do not be fooled behind the velvet curtain. The scorekeeping was intense and very real. There was absolutely a period where their management teams were tallying up who got the loudest standing ovation, who secured the prime slot in the telecast, and whose tour was pulling in more cash at the box office. Jessica Williams, a veteran promoter in the country scene, spills the tea, noting that they were far too classy to ever bring it up in an interview. But everybody in their orbit knew exactly what the score was on that invisible scoreboard. What makes this dynamic so captivating is the sheer discipline it took for both women to maintain a flawless facade of sisterhood despite fighting for the same throne. They sang duets, handed each other trophies and gushed about one another to the press, a total masterclass in how to handle a professional threat with absolute dignity. I have a deep admiration for the empire Reba constructed, and I truly hope she looks at what I built with that same respect, Dolly mused in her memoir released in 2023. We have been climbing the exact same mountain, just taking different trails to get to the peak. The truth is, sometimes the person trying to beat you is the only reason you push yourself hard enough to win. That competitive edge seems to have dulled a bit in recent years, mostly because both of them are now untouchable living legends with their legacies carved in stone. They have started sharing the spotlight more often and even cracking jokes about their similar paths to glory. Yet those decades of walking on eggshells around each other's triumphs expose a relationship that is far deeper and knottier than the best friends narrative they sold us. We have never exchanged a harsh word, Dolly maintains, and industry insiders believe that is technically true because their war was too smart for shouting matches. Instead, the battle was fought through calculated career pivots, strategically timed album drops, and the meticulous polishing of their opposing images. As country music historian Robert Ehrman points out, this was not a feud, it was chess. Their rivalry might just be the most elegantly handled power struggle in the history of show business. They took a situation that the tabloids wanted to turn into a catfight and flipped it into a lesson on how powerful women can respect each other while still going for the jugular. Let me tell you, she is incredible. She is a powerhouse of talent. She is deep. She is whip smart, and she has a sensitive soul. And that girl has been through the ringer. She has survived a lot of external pressure, and she has put herself through just as much internal fire. There are very few bonds in Dolly Parton's world that blur the line between family and business as thoroughly as her connection with Miley Cyrus. As the godmother to Billy Ray Cyrus's daughter, Dolly has had a front row seat to Miley's wild transformation from a Disney darling to a boundary-pushing pop star. She views her with the complex mix of emotions you would expect from a protective aunt who is also a seasoned veteran of the fame game. I love that girl like I gave birth to her myself, Dolly has said time and time again when asked about Miley. Lately, Dolly has been peeling back the curtain a bit more, spilling the tea on the rocky road she walked with Miley during the pop star's massive shift from being a squeaky clean Disney kid to a boundary-smashing rebel. It was a subtle shade when Dolly admitted on live TV back in 2021 that while she never doubted Miley's heart, she certainly questioned her judgment calls. That is a massive break from character for the Queen of Country, who usually sugarcoats everything, giving us a rare glimpse of the grit behind the glitter regarding her goddaughter's wild years. Don't get it twisted, there has always been a deep ride or die love between these two music legends that defines their bond. Growing up, Miley didn't just see Aunt Dolly. She saw the ultimate playbook on how to conquer Nashville and Hollywood simultaneously without breaking a sweat. And on the flip side, Dolly looked at that spunky kid and saw a reflection of her own hungry, ambitious younger self, ready to take on the world. But that sweet family dynamic hit a major speed bump when Miley decided to murder her Hannah Montana persona and reinvent herself overnight. Between twerking on Robin Thicke at the 2013 VMAs and dropping music videos that were pure shock value, and openly celebrating party substances, Miley was doing everything Dolly had spent decades strategically avoiding to keep her pristine reputation intact despite her own liberal views. In her 2023 memoir, Dolly didn't mince words, confessing that watching Miley spiral during that era was absolute torture for her. She totally got the need to shed the mouse ears, but she was terrified that Miley was digging a hole so deep she'd never be able to climb back out of it. Dolly even admitted to calling Miley reckless to her face, which is probably the closest the country saint has ever come to trash-talking someone she adores. Coming from a woman who finds the silver lining in a hurricane, that kind of blunt criticism proves just how scared she was while watching Miley try to survive the brutal jump from child star to adult icon. The irony here is thick because Dolly wasn't exactly a nun back in the day. She was a total pioneer when it came to shaking things up. She built an empire by weaponizing her femininity and rocking outfits that would make a preacher blush. But the secret sauce was always Dolly's radar. She knew exactly where the line was and how to toe it without stepping over. She kept the mystery alive without scaring off the conservative church crowd that bought her records. According to industry insiders like former Sony exec Patricia Thompson, Dolly's biggest fear was that Miley was making powerful enemies way too early in the game. Dolly's philosophy was always about building bridges, not blowing them up. She watched in horror as her goddaughter seemed intent on lighting a match to her own path before she even reached the destination. You could feel the chill in the air, the lack of joint photo ops, and the silence in the press during that era screamed that things were icy behind closed doors. But here is the kicker. Unlike most Hollywood friendships that explode and vanish into the tabloids, this one didn't break. It actually morphed into something deeper and more respectful as Miley started to level out and rethink her strategy. The thaw started when Miley began dipping her toes back into country waters, finally realising that maybe Aunt Dolly actually knew a thing or two about longevity in this brutal business. And Dolly being the class act she is, started admitting to the press that Miley needed to walk her own road, bumps and all, even if that road went in a completely different direction than the one Dolly would have paved for her. The real turning point was that iconic 2019 Grammy performance of Jolene. You could see the tears in their eyes. That wasn't just acting, that was healing happening live on stage. Since that night, the Love Fest is back on and they can't stop gushing about each other to anyone who will listen. But it is different now. It has got the kind of weight and texture that only comes after you have survived a real storm together. Dolly laid it out in 2022, saying the gloves are off now. She knows disapproval doesn't mean a lack of love, and she accepts that Miley's truth isn't the same as hers. That is the definition of blood sticking around for the messy parts, not just the photo ops. This whole saga proves that out of all the people in her orbit, Miley is the one who actually feels like real complicated family to Dolly. It has got all the ingredients: the screaming matches, the silent treatments, and the tearful reunions. Just like any actual family dinner at Thanksgiving, minus the paparazzi. We have got a million things to giggle about, Dolly said, and honestly, she just cracks me up constantly. Just sitting next to her sharing those filthy jokes, only we know. We're just two crazy people. Hold on a second. Did I say we know? You better watch your mouth. All right, somebody cut that part out. Item number 3. The gambler himself, Kenny Rogers. When you mix friendship with business for 4 decades, things get interesting. They gave us absolute bangers like Islands in the Stream and Real Love, defining a generation of duets. The way they looked at each other on stage sold a fantasy of perfect harmony that had fans all over the globe swooning. But don't let the smiles fool you. Dolly has started spilling the beans that even this dream team had plenty of behind-the-scenes drama and personality clashes. "We loved each other to death," she admitted. "But Lord, we drove each other absolutely batty," Dolly confessed in a 2022 tribute. "Kenny had a hard time listening, and I have a hard time taking orders." Yet it was exactly that stubborn friction that created the sparks flying off the vinyl records. This honest take pulls back the curtain on a dynamic that was way more layered and spicy than the polished PR version we were fed for years. The friendship was 100% real right up until we lost Kenny in 2020, but making the music happen required navigating a minefield of different artistic egos and business styles. To put it bluntly, they were like mixing oil and water, completely incompatible elements trying to exist in the same space. That is the inside scoop from legendary Grammy-winning producer David Foster, who had a front row seat to the madness while working with both music icons. You have to understand that Kenny was incredibly methodical and precise, a total perfectionist who needed every single beat planned out on paper. Dolly, on the other hand, is pure intuition, spontaneous energy, and she trusts her gut instincts 100% when she steps into the booth. Naturally, that created some fascinating and often volatile tensions behind the scenes. These radically different approaches led to plenty of heated conflicts and awkward moments during their recording sessions. Rogers, with his sophisticated background in jazz and pop production, always preferred structured arrangements and very precise technical vocal delivery. Meanwhile, Dolly, who is deeply rooted in those raw Appalachian musical traditions, often wanted to chase her emotional impulses and just improvise right there in the moment, regardless of the sheet music. Studio musician Randy Scruggs remembers that Kenny would get visibly frustrated when Dolly decided to change her phrasing on literally every single take, making it impossible to splice together. And conversely, she would get irritated and feel stifled when he wanted to map out every single breath and note weeks in advance. At the end of the day, they both wanted total control of the process, just in completely different ways, and their complicated business relationship only added another thick layer of drama to the mix. While both of them were incredibly savvy entrepreneurs who built empires, they approached their major career decisions from opposite ends of the spectrum. Rogers built his massive brand on consistency and calculated risk management, whereas Dolly was much more of a wild card, willing to take massive creative gambles that could potentially alienate huge chunks of her fan base. This fundamental difference came to a boiling point during their 1984 tour, where fierce disagreements over production elements blew up. Everything from the song selection down to the merchandise choices created backstage tensions that were so thick they occasionally spilled right out onto the stage during performances. There were several concerts where fans noticed they seemed physically distant on stage, with that effortless chemistry that usually defined their collaborations temporarily dimmed by the backstage fighting. Former tour director Michael Jenkins reveals there was actually a brutal 2-week stretch where they refused to speak and only communicated through their managers. Kenny was convinced that Dolly was not taking the serious business side of the tour seriously enough. On the flip side, Dolly felt that Kenny was sacrificing all the magic and spontaneity just to play it safe. And honestly, from their own perspectives, they were both absolutely right. Yet, despite these periodic clashes of ego and style, what truly distinguished their relationship was a fundamental respect and deep affection that allowed them to navigate these blow-ups without causing permanent damage. Unlike so many other famous musical partnerships that fracture irreparably the moment creative differences arise, Dolly and Kenny consistently managed to find their way back to harmony, proving their bond was stronger than their arguments. "We really had a brother-sister dynamic," Dolly explained in her recent reflections. "We would fight like cats and dogs, make up, completely forget why we were mad, and then do it all over again the next month. But through all the screaming matches and silent treatments, we never once doubted the genuine love underneath it all." This delicate balance between genuine friendship and professional friction produced one of the most enduring partnerships in music history, spanning decades and encompassing numerous projects far beyond just their famous duets. Their relationship really demonstrates how creative tension, when it is balanced with mutual respect, is not always a bad thing. It can actually enhance rather than destroy a musical collaboration. Rogers himself acknowledged this unique dynamic shortly before his passing. Dolly and I disagreed about plenty of things, but we never disagreed about what mattered most: the music and the fans. Everything else was just background noise and static that we had to work through to get to the good stuff. In the end, their occasional conflicts may have been the secret ingredient that kept their partnership fresh and their performances vibrant across 4 incredible decades. It serves as a lesson in how even the most beloved collaborations in music require constant navigation of complex human dynamics behind the velvet curtain. Switching gears, our next guests are 3 absolute legends. 3 great singers who have collaborated on this wonderful compact disc right here. It is titled Trio 2, and it serves as the long-awaited follow-up to the Grammy Award-winning album they crafted over a decade ago. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to the icons Emmylou Harris, Linda Ronstadt and Dolly Parton. Now let's talk about part 2 involving Linda Ronstadt. This is where creative brilliance meets some serious personal distance. The trio album uniting the powerhouse voices of Dolly Parton, Linda Ronstadt and Emmylou Harris is widely regarded as one of the greatest collaborative masterpieces in the history of country music. The 1987 release and its 1999 sequel showcase 3 distinct vocal approaches, blending into a kind of transcendent harmony that chills the bone. But while the musical chemistry was undeniable on record, the personal dynamics, particularly between Dolly and Linda, were far more complicated and chilly than fans ever realised. We made magic together in the booth, but we were definitely not friends after the sessions wrapped. Dolly acknowledged this in a surprisingly frank and honest interview with Variety back in 2020. Sometimes the most beautiful, heart-wrenching music comes from people who do not necessarily connect on any other level. This revelation absolutely stunned many fans who had fantasized that the 3 women were best friends united by their pioneering roles as women in a male-dominated industry. The reality, as Dolly has finally begun to discuss more openly in recent years, involved significant personality differences and creative tensions that prevented the working relationship from ever evolving into a genuine friendship. Linda had a certain coldness to her personality that I never quite got past. Dolly confided to her biographer in some recently published conversations that shed new light on the era. She had a brilliant mind and was an extraordinary musician, but there was always a distance there. I come from a world where warmth and connection matter just as much as talent. She operated differently. This assessment really touches on the fundamental contrast between their approaches to life and art. Dolly, who was born and bred in the deep, close-knit embrace of Appalachian culture, approached her craft with a raw, emotional openness and a gut-level intuition that defined both her music and her love life. On the other side of the coin, you had Ronstadt, who came from a background steeped in formal training and tackled every arrangement with a sharp, cerebral and almost academic precision. Unlike Dolly, Linda kept up some serious walls, maintaining a strict iron curtain between her stage persona and her private reality to ensure they never bled into each other. According to music historian Robert K. Orman, these 2 legends weren't just different, they were practically standing on opposite ends of the country music universe. Dolly was the definition of self-made, instinctual, untamed, and deeply rooted in the storytelling soil of traditional country music. Linda, meanwhile, was a technician, methodical, deliberate, and painting with colours from a much wider and more eclectic musical palette, creating a mix that was bound to cause both brilliant artistic friction and personal distance. When they finally got together to record the legendary first trio album back in 1987, those glaring contrasts were brought into sharp, undeniable focus. Even though all three women were massive superstars in their own right, they walked into that studio with wildly different game plans, priorities and operating manuals. Poor Emmylou Harris basically had to play the role of peacekeeper, constantly mediating between Dolly's shoot-from-the-hip emotional style and Linda's calculated, laser-focused obsession with perfection. It got so intense that Dolly reportedly whispered to her band members during that era, "Linda just doesn't appreciate her roots." She was taking a dig at what she felt was Ronstadt's intellectual detachment from the gritty, bleeding heart that defines true country music traditions. That private remark, which was definitely never meant for the tabloids, really pulls back the curtain on just how frustrated Dolly was becoming behind the scenes. She just couldn't wrap her head around a music-making philosophy that seemed to value technical flawlessness over the messy, genuine soul of emotional authenticity. To be fair, Ronstadt has always tipped her hat to Dolly's immense natural gifts, even while admitting that they operate on completely different wavelengths. Linda once noted that Dolly grasps something primal about connecting with an audience, something you simply cannot learn in any conservatory or music school. She observed that while they both aim for the truth, they take completely different roads to get to the heart of a song. And trust me, those clashing approaches didn't stop at the microphone. They spilled right over into how they handled big business and their public brands. While both were trailblazing women calling their own shots, Dolly leaned all the way into a carefully curated persona, perfectly balancing her real self with a dash of Hollywood theatricality. Ronstadt, she wanted absolutely nothing to do with that kind of glittery packaging or marketing spin. She chased a raw, unvarnished public image that felt more real to her, even if it sometimes meant taking a hit on her mainstream commercial appeal. Producer Tony Brown, who had the unique experience of working with both icons, suggests that Dolly sometimes found Linda's blunt nature a bitter pill to swallow. See, Dolly moves through the world using charm, wit and southern diplomacy, while Linda just says exactly what is on her mind with zero filter attached. You don't need a degree in psychology to see that those two personality types are just not naturally going to align. Yet, despite all the personal drama and differences, they held on to enough professional respect to lay down some of the most iconic tracks in music history. The fact that they could check their personal baggage at the door to serve the music speaks volumes about their shared professionalism, even if the room wasn't exactly warm and fuzzy. The story of their complicated dynamic serves as a stark reminder that you don't need to be best friends to make world-class history-making art. Sometimes that magic spark happens specifically because of the tension between two opposing forces rather than in spite of it. Reflecting on it recently, Dolly admitted with her usual grace, "I will always cherish what we built and created together. But I learned a hard lesson. Sometimes you can harmonise perfectly with someone's vocal cords without ever truly harmonising with their spirit." And honestly, that is a music lesson all on its own. Now here is a track that has been mighty good to both me and Dolly. A huge thank you to everyone who went out and bought it or requested it on the radio. This one is titled "If Teardrops Were Pennies." Number 1, Porter Wagoner, transforming from a trusted mentor into a bitter adversary. If you dig into the archives of Dolly Parton's career, you will find no relationship more pivotal or more messy than her 7-year saga with Porter Wagoner. What started as the golden ticket for a young starry-eyed Dolly eventually curdled into a toxic business nightmare that could only be settled inside a courtroom. The long winding road between those two extremes tells you everything you need to know about the power games in Nashville and Dolly's rise from a shy protege to an unstoppable powerhouse. He put my name in lights and then he put my life through hell. That is how Dolly recently summed it up in perhaps her most brutally honest take yet on their tangled history. She added, "I will always be thankful for the platform he gave me, but gratitude does not mean signing up to be owned and controlled for the rest of your life." When a 21-year-old Dolly stepped onto the set of the Porter Wagoner show back in 1967 to replace fan favourite Norma Jean, she was walking into a dynamic where the boss held all the cards. Wagoner was already Nashville royalty, sitting pretty with his own hit TV show and a thriving recording career. Dolly, on the other hand, was just a scrappy songwriter with a lot of promise but barely a blip on the radar as a solo artist. On paper, the initial arrangement looked like a massive win-win situation for everyone involved. Porter got himself a powerhouse vocalist and a brilliant writer to spice up his show, while Dolly got the kind of national TV exposure that usually takes decades to grind for. Their duets were instant gold with the fans, and her solo spots finally gave America a taste of what Dolly Parton was really made of. But lurking right beneath that shiny, mutually beneficial surface, the seeds of a massive future conflict were already being planted. Porter Wagoner was widely known in the industry as a control freak, a man who demanded absolute dominance over his business dealings, expecting his new discovery to bow down not just professionally, but artistically as well. According to Porter, he was the boss of everything. He wanted to call the shots on my songwriting, rearrange my music, decide what I wore, and even tell my band how to play. Dolly revealed in explosive conversations with her biographer. In the beginning, I was green and desperate for his guidance, soaking it all up like a sponge. But as I found my own voice and grew into a true artist, his heavy-handed control started to feel like a noose tightening around my neck. The tension in the studio became thick enough to cut with a knife as Dolly's solo record started skyrocketing up the chart, leaving their duet performances in the dust. With self-penned masterpieces like Jolene and the legendary I Will Always Love You, she was proving to the world that her songwriting genius was way too big to be contained within the narrow borders of the traditional country format. It was becoming painfully obvious that she had the potential for a massive crossover career, one that would completely eclipse the older, more conservative audience that Wagoner had spent his life cultivating. Porter simply couldn't swallow his pride and accept the fact that the bird he had trained was spreading her wings and they were getting far too large for the little nest he had built for her. Reflecting on the turmoil, Dolly noted that he had been both a mentor and a manager to her, but somewhere along the line, his ego got those roles twisted up with the idea of ownership. He thought he owned me. The situation reached a boiling point in 1974 when Dolly made the hard decision to quit Wagoner's show to chase her solo dreams, turning what could have been a friendly handshake goodbye into a bitter, nasty feud. At first, Wagoner dug his heels in and flat out refused to let her out of her contract, holding her legal obligations over her head like a weapon to make her stay. Then he pivoted to greed, demanding huge percentage points of her publishing rights and recording catalogues, claiming it was fair compensation for the fact that he was the one who made her a star. I wrote I Will Always Love You as a peace offering to try and stop the fighting. Dolly explained about the origins of what would become one of the most iconic songs in music history. I literally sat down and wrote that song to say goodbye to Porter in the gentlest, most heartfelt way I knew how. I played it for him in his office, praying it would soften his heart enough to let me go without a war. He sat there and cried his eyes out when he heard it, but as soon as the tears dried, he looked at me and said he'd let me go only if I gave him the publishing rights to that song. This outrageous request, which Dolly smartly refused right then and there, highlighted the fundamental, unbridgeable gap in how the two of them viewed their partnership and their future. Wagoner viewed himself as the grand architect of the Dolly Parton brand, believing he was entitled to a cut of her paycheck forever because he laid the foundation. On the flip side, Dolly recognised and respected the crucial role he played in her start, but she stood firm in her belief that her God-given talents and her future belonged to her and her alone. The collapse of their professional marriage eventually dragged on into a messy legal battle, forcing Dolly to cough up a significant settlement check just to untangle herself completely from Wagoner's business clause. That massive financial hit was the concrete price she had to pay to buy her creative independence and secure her professional freedom once and for all. It was worth every single penny, Dolly stated emphatically years later, looking back on the ordeal. You simply cannot put a price tag on the freedom of owning yourself. What makes this toxic entanglement so pivotal in Dolly's life story is how it radically reshaped her approach to the music business from that day forward. After experiencing firsthand just how dangerous it is to let someone else hold the keys to your destiny, she transformed into a fierce pioneer for artist autonomy, refusing to ever be vulnerable again. She became obsessed with maintaining full ownership of her publishing catalogue and built business structures designed specifically to ensure she never had to answer to a man like that again. The final chapter of their complicated rollercoaster relationship didn't happen until decades later, long after the lawyers and the shouting matches were gone. By then, an elderly Wagner had fallen on hard times, facing serious health issues and financial ruin, and he reached out to his former protege one last time. In a truly remarkable show of grace and her immense capacity for forgiveness, Dolly didn't turn her back. She not only reconciled with him, but also quietly covered his expenses and provided financial support during his final years. I was there and I took care of Porter at the very end of his life. Dolly revealed, showing the depth of her loyalty despite everything that had happened between them. I didn't do it because I had forgotten the hard parts or the lawsuits. I did it because I also remembered the good times, and there were plenty of those too. He gave me my big break, even if he tried to shackle me down later on. Both sides of that coin are the truth, and I honour both of them. This complex journey from a golden opportunity to oppressive control and finally to a touching reconciliation perfectly captures Dolly's incredible ability to navigate the rockiest of relationships. She managed to do it all without ever surrendering her personal boundaries or losing her capacity for compassion, striking a balance that few superstars ever achieve.